and thanks everyone for being here for the Capture, Create, Protein, Innovates webinar. We're lucky today to have Dr. Jim House from the University of Manitoba. He's a professor in the Department of Food and Human Nutritional Sciences. He completed his PhD in amino acid nutrition and metabolism from the University of Guelph in Ontario. And his research program has advanced the understanding of factors affecting the utilization of plant and animal-based protein sources in human diet. And Jim is one of the co-grantees of the Capture Create. So we're really pleased to have him giving a presentation for us today. And we'll get started. I guess just before we do get started, Jim, I'm going to take this opportunity to remind everybody that our next Capture Create webinar will be on February 27th. Jitendra Palawal will be presenting on high-resolution imaging of pulse flowers, so that should be really cool too. And I'll be sending out registration information for that one probably by the end of the week. So Jim, I'm just going to pass the con to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Lenore.
Okay.
I'll just share my screen. Well, thanks everyone for attending. It's an honor to be here. I'm happy to be here representing all the trainees in my lab, past and present, and looking forward to having a discussion with you about understanding the factors influencing the nutritional quality of plant-based foods. Just as a bit of an outline, these are the areas that I hope to cover today to look at some drivers of plant-based food consumption. And essentially, one of the areas that how I like to approach this is talking about sustainability across 4 dimensions. And so I'll introduce what those dimensions are. It helps to sort of reflect upon all of the components that go into the broader understanding of the term sustainable. And then I want to share with you some of the data that we've been generating from our lab and also with some collaborators looking at positioning plant-based proteins in the Canadian diet. And then really the opportunity to define nutritional quality. And I'm going to talk primarily about protein quality, but also about nutrient density and touch upon some anti-nutritive factors that I think we need to be paying attention to, as well as putting that in context with respect to challenges and opportunities for the plant-based protein sector. But first of all, when we think about a sustainable protein food system, essentially what we're thinking about is sort of this classic diagram where you have a system in place, and typically it starts at the level of food production, and that's more or less, it could be farm to fork. So where you simply are looking at the opportunities to monitor plant-based foods as it goes through food production, storage and distribution, processing, marketing and distribution, preparation and consumption, and ultimately resource and waste management. These are all components of a sustainable protein food system. It's presented here as a bit of a circular diagram, but in actual fact, it's more of a very complex web because these are all interacting components. And when I refer to sustainability, as I mentioned, I like to talk about the 4 dimensions of sustainability. You might be more familiar with 3, sort of the environmental factors, environmental definition of sustainability, economic considerations, the sociocultural factors, but also we need to be mindful that health is an important consideration of overall sustainability of our food system, in particular as we talk about protein foods. So I want to introduce some of those dimensions with some examples in terms of how the areas that are being impacted and what factors we need to be considering. So when we look at environmental considerations, a lot of discussion right now is looking at maintaining greenhouse gas emissions, water, land use, nitrogen, phosphorus application, and chemical pollution within set targets. In particular, anyone who's been paying attention to what's happening at the national and the global level, really carbon capture, understanding CO2 emissions is critical to our environmental considerations around sustainability. And there's a lot of what we do in agriculture that plays a role in impacting greenhouse gas emissions. But beyond sort of greenhouse gas emissions, we also be needing to be paying close attention to preserving biodiversity, to ensure that we've got genetic resources and livestock and aquatic resources that can ensure that we have a diverse food system moving forward, that we're not solely dependent on one or two or three primary crops. And of course, looking at minimizing use of inputs such as hormones, antibiotics, plastics, and packaging materials. These are basically pulled from the Sustainable Healthy Diets approach, which was published back in 2019 from the FAO and WHO. Now, I just want to give you just a bit of an example. I'm sure this won't be a surprise to many of you, but when we're looking at food production and global greenhouse gas or GHG emissions, I think one of the areas that we do need to be mindful of is the impact that our food system has on global greenhouse gas emissions. So here's two charts. One's on the left is primarily plant-based foods, or it is plant-based foods, and the one on the right is animal-based systems. And you can see the global greenhouse gas emissions in basically teragrams, so huge amounts of carbon dioxide equivalents. And the two main culprits, one on the plant side is rice, and that's basically due to the methane that's produced during rice paddy production. And also beef production has always been limited or linked to enhanced greenhouse gas emissions. And so when we look at dairy and beef and pork, those tend to be the primary contributors on the animal side to greenhouse gas emissions. Whereas on the plant-based side, it's primarily rice and wheat, which are the primary contributors. But from a scale perspective, you can see that when we're talking about the emissions coming from beef production, it's substantial and double that of rice production. So there's a significant amount of greenhouse gas coming from beef production, which has really led to, I would say, a real renaissance in plant-based food positioning from a sustainability standpoint. There are whole companies looking at marketing their products in terms of their environmental or sustainability footprint. And I think this is a primary component that we use to address that, is the overall contributions to greenhouse gases. So just something for consideration. Now, if we think about the economic dimension, these are some of the elements, again, from the position back in the FAO WHO 2019 document, but looking at affordable food for everyone, reducing food loss and waste, looking at making sure that we have an economically viable future production, and then ensuring that we have sustainable transportation and supply chains. Well, certainly this is a very important area right now. Anyone who's been to the grocery store can understand or can reconcile that our food prices have gone up considerably in the past year and a half. And there's a number of reasons, but supply chain issues is one of the key considerations that is leading to increases in price disruption and increased prices within the grocery store. But I wanted to position this area around food loss and waste. I think we recognize that food loss and waste is a major contributing factor, but this next slide, I think, really highlights this issue. If you look at food waste and global greenhouse gas emissions, and this is just from the American perspective. So this is the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and they published a document in 2021 called From Farm to Kitchen, the environmental impacts of U.S. food waste. And so what I'm showing you here is basically an infographic drawn from that report, which looks at the annual environmental footprint of producing, storing, processing, packaging, distributing, and marketing food that is ultimately lost or wasted in the United States. So lost really refers to the pre-consumer, and waste is at the consumer level. And so here's 4 examples, like greenhouse gas emissions, waste and loss alone accounts for the global greenhouse gas emissions of 42 coal-fired power plants on an annual basis. Enough water and energy to supply more than 50 million homes. The amount of fertilizer used to grow all plant-based foods on an annual basis, and an area of agricultural land equal to California and New York. When you start putting waste and loss in that perspective, you can I think start to understand why we need to pay more attention to food waste and food loss. And so there's a role to be played within the protein food system to really understand how we can make an impact there. One of the other dimensions, the third dimension, is the sociocultural considerations. And so discussions about how accessible the food supply is, how desirable that food supply is, avoiding adverse gender-related impacts, time allocation for buying, preparing food, acquiring water and fuel. Primarily, if you think, we're thinking globally here. And so if you're thinking about areas of the world where water and fuel acquisition is important for food preparation, that's a lot of time that can be allocated to that. And so we need to be mindful of those components. And also that it's built on a respect and respects culture, practices, knowledge, and consumption patterns of in particular subgroups of the population. So social cultural considerations are really key. I'm just going to touch upon this desirability component. Well, one way to look at desirability is how consumers speak with their pocketbooks. Now, this is a slide from 2021. It's really important to understand that because data from 2022 is probably significantly different than this data from 2021. But if you're looking at total plant-based foods, plant-based meat, and plant-based milks, this is a graphic from the Good Food Institute and SPINS, which basically reported dollar sales, 1 year dollar growth, annualized 3 year dollar growth, the dollar share, 3-year share, unit sales, household penetration. That basically means how many households are actually looking at utilizing these types of products, and then the repeat rate, how many people are buying it again. That's a really critical component. It's great to get people to buy it once, but if they're not repeat customers, then it's very challenging to make the market grow. But you can see for total plant-based foods, dollar sales of 7.4 billion, with 1 year growth in 2021 of 6% and a 3-year dollar growth of 54%. You can see it still captures a fairly small percent, total plant-based foods of the total grocery dollar of 4%. Plant-based meat is even lower at 1.4%. But milks have made significant inroads with respect to household acceptance and penetration. So you're looking at the dollar share of 16%. And significant growth still within these commodities. Now, I did mention that this is 2021. The data for 2022 aren't released yet, but I think one of the things we've recognized is that sales of across the board in all categories have been impacted by the overall food costs. And so I think that's something that we will be mindful of in terms of the impact that it's having on certain plant-based food categories. And so once that data comes out, I think it'll be really interesting to contrast it with the 2021 data. Now, the final factor, the dimension that I want to consider, and that's really the area that I'll spend most of the time on for today, is talking about health considerations and defining sustainable diets. And here we're really looking at sort of the balance between plant and animal sources, ensuring that we've got that balance. The question is, what should that balance be? I'll provide some examples of that in just a moment. The adequate energy and nutrients for requirements to meeting human amino acid, nutrient, energy requirements, reducing risk of chronic disease, and minimal or zero levels of pathogens or toxins that can cause foodborne illness. So these are all some of the health considerations that we see when we're defining sustainable diets from a health perspective. I'm sharing this data because I think it's really important to recognize that not all plant-based diets are created equal. So when you're looking at this graph, I want you to look at the blue line, which is a sort of the plant-based dietary index. If you just look at that blue line, you can see that the risk of developing type 2 diabetes actually goes down as your intake of the plant-based diet increases. So when the deciles, so at the highest level, D10 would mean that you're at the highest level of intake. And so the blue line represents sort of plant-based diets overall. But if you actually separate that data out into healthy versus unhealthy, a healthy plant-based dietary index would include whole grains, fruits, vegetables, nuts, legumes, vegetable oils, tea, and coffee. You can see that you actually reduce the risk a little bit. It's probably significant at the highest levels of intake relative to just the overall plant-based diet. But if you look at an unhealthy plant-based diet, so fruit juices, sugar-sweetened beverages that are based on high fructose corn syrup, refined grains, sweets and desserts, and potatoes. You find that this index actually shows an increased risk of type 2 diabetes as you get to higher levels of accumulation. So that's really important to understand, is that not all plant-based diets are created equal. And I'll give some more examples of that in just a few moments. One of the reasons why I wanted to share some of this data with you is to start looking at what we have in terms of dietary recommendations at a national level. So in Canada, from we're looking at our dietary guidelines, we used Canada's Food Guide. And I'm sure some of you might be familiar with an older version of the guide, which is Eating Well with Canada's Food Guide, where it was basically a rainbow, and the size of the arc of the rainbow indicated the relative amounts that you should consume. And you can see that the highest amounts were associated with the outer end of the rainbow, and the green was fruits and vegetables. Then you get into the grains category. Then you get into the milk and dairy categories and alternatives. And then you get into the meats and alternatives category. Well, when Health Canada revised Canada's Food Guide, they moved to an alternative approach, and it was very much in line with what other countries are doing, in particular the US with the MyPlate system. So they moved to a guide that emphasizes whole foods. You can see it on this plate. Now, this is an aspirational plate. It's not meant to show you what you're supposed to eat for every meal. These are examples of foods that fit within a category, for example, fruits and vegetables. And this is meant to show you that half of your plate should be fruits and vegetables. Quarter of your plate should be protein foods. You can see there's no longer a category for dairy or meats and alternatives. It's called protein foods. A quarter of your plate for grains, in particular whole grain foods. And then make water your drink of choice. This is a big difference between our guide and the US guide, and the fact that there's a glass of milk here in the US, and whereas we have water in Canada's Food Guide. So this guideline, as I mentioned, is aspirational. It's meant to be sort of a healthy dietary pattern, but I think it's really important to reflect on what Canadians are actually eating. So I'm going to share with you some data that we actually were part of a couple of studies that were conducted in collaboration with the University of Toronto. And we looked at the distribution of plant and animal protein in the Canadian diet. And we talked about balance being the key. Well, I think it's good to know what our baseline data looks like. And so if we're looking at intakes, and this is from the 2015, so this is the most recent cycle of nutrition data that we have available on a population basis to analyze. And what it's essentially saying is that about 64% of our protein is coming from animal sources on average in the Canadian diet, and about 36 to 37% is coming from plant protein. But what do you think those major sources of those proteins are? So what do you think contributes most to animal protein? What do you think contributes most to plant protein? I think you might be surprised when I show you some of this data. Now, obviously, we were interested in the protein component. And so we looked at the contribution of how much females and males are actually consuming if we segregated segmented the population into quartiles of plant protein consumption. So this first row here, 0 to 24.9, that essentially means that they're consuming 0 to 24.9% of their protein is coming from plant protein. So this column is mainly your animal protein eaters. And then it goes 25 to 49% plant protein, 50 to 74.9, and then 75 to 100% plant protein. So this is primarily your plant protein eaters on the right-hand side. So I think the first thing you'll see is that as you increase, the amount of protein, actual protein, goes down in the population in terms of the grams of protein being consumed by both males and females. So, and then you can see that the percent that are below the recommendation increases. So if the estimated average requirement for females is 44 grams, you can see that about 36 to 37% of females are below the estimated average requirement for those that are consuming mainly plant-based protein sources. Males, it's even higher. About 50% are below the estimated average requirement of 50 grams if they are consuming mainly plant-based protein. Now, this is just crude protein. This is just, I measure the protein, it's in the database, and this is your crude protein that's out. What happens if we actually look at the quality of that protein? And that's what this next study was looking at. If we actually look at the amount of quality corrected protein, taking into account the amino acid composition, the digestibility of those protein sources, what does it tell us about the amount of quality corrected protein that's being consumed in the Canadian diet? Well, here it is overall. So this is both males and females combined. And so again, in this low category where it's mainly a lot of animal protein, the total protein intake is 1.44 grams per kilo per day, when the estimated average requirement is 0.66. So we're actually, and the PDCAS is 0.9. So this is, as I'll mention in a second, is a way to correct the protein. So the higher the PDCAS value, so 1 would be, it's the highest quality protein in this system. It's showing you essentially that the corrected protein is about 1.41. So they're consuming a lot of high quality protein. And that stands to reason because animal proteins tend to be of a higher quality nature. And as you increase the amount of plant protein, the amount of corrected protein goes down to the point where actually the PDCAS is actually indicating that we're well below requirement in this group that's consuming mainly plant-based proteins. And so paying attention to protein quality in this plant protein consumer group is going to be important. And we need to understand what they are actually consuming within that category. But let's look a little bit at the nutrients. This is a very busy slide, so I'm just going to focus on, again, it's the same design, but it's looking at all the nutrients and the categories going from 0 to 25 all the way up to 75 to 100%. And you can see, just as an example, vitamin D. Animal proteins tend to be higher in vitamin D, and so vitamin D intake goes down as for those people who are consuming mainly plant-based protein. Dietary folate equivalents, however, tends to go up, and there's a pretty good reason for that, as well as if you think about our fortification policies, where we're primarily fortifying grain-based products. And so I've just given you a little hint about what plant-based consumers are eating. And if you look at vitamin B12, it goes down. Again, another primarily animal-based protein source. It goes down as we increase. And so these are nutrients that we need to pay attention to. This is data for females older than 19. You see the same patterns in males. Essentially, vitamin D goes down as you increase the proportion of plant-based protein that's consumed, folate goes up, and vitamin B12 goes down. And there's other areas that we need to pay attention to. For example, dietary fiber increases dramatically as you increase the amount of plant protein that's being consumed as a proportion in the diet. Okay, and saturated fats goes down. I just highlighted a couple here to just give you some reference here. Now, here's the slide that may or may not be familiar to you in terms of what people are actually eating in those categories. And so I don't think it's very much of a surprise on the left-hand side when you're looking at the primarily animal eaters. They're eating a lot of meat, dairy, and fish. As you start increasing, meat goes down, dairy goes down. And then when you get into this high category, the primary, it's not nuts and legumes that people are consuming. They're getting a lot of their protein from breads, rolls, and crackers and grains. And so about 40% of their protein is actually coming from grain-based sources. And so I think that's important to recognize. Even though we try to get people to eat legumes, it's only about 7%. Legumes don't even fit in some of these other categories. So I think what this does is highlight a real opportunity for us to continue to focus on ways that we can enhance the protein quality of these grains and bread rolls and crackers, because if people are eating them, we need to make sure that they are a little bit more balanced when we start thinking about the protein that is being supplied, because this group, particularly on the right-hand side, are the ones that are consuming diets which tend to be not meeting their needs for protein quality. And that can then pose challenges from a perspective of wound healing, looking at potential for sarcopenia or muscle loss, in particular as we age, could play a role in paying attention to the quality of the protein that's in our diet. So let's go back to this picture of Canada's Food Guide. And I think one of the big questions that that we should ask is, can processed plant-based foods fit within the health domain of a sustainable diet? So if I show you this picture, you can see there's not a lot of processed foods. All Health Canada will say there's a little dish of yogurt there. Okay, well, that's minimally processed, I would argue. Some of these foods, fruits and veg, are frozen. That's very minimal processing. But only on the grain side do you see some foods like pasta or breads that would have some minor elements of processing attached to them on this particular diagram. Whereas if we're thinking about the foodscape that we're looking at for plant-based foods, it's much more diverse with potential options such as plant-based beverages, meat alternatives like the Impossible Whopper, snack foods and drinks and confectionery products, and a lot of these meat alternatives that are based on plant-based protein sources such as pea protein, for example. So the question that remains is, can these foods fit within the health domain of a sustainable diet? So let's look at a couple of areas that we need to pay attention to. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the NOVA classification system. If you're not, you should be, because it's playing a role in particular on a global level in impacting decisions being made around dietary guidance. And typically the NOVA food classification system goes from the left, the green side, which is unprocessed or minimally processed foods, which is a lot of what you saw on Canada's food guide plate, to ingredients, to processed foods, which can be minimally processed foods such as pasteurization, baking, etc. Then to this group where you see a lot of attention being placed is what is being called ultra-processed foods. And there's a lot of research going on in the nutrition field about the role that ultra-processed foods plays in long-term health and risk for chronic disease within our populations. Because in here you find like sugar-sweetened beverages, you find foods that basically are high energy density, low nutrient density. And so I think this is an area that is getting a lot of attention. Now, one of the reasons why, and this is an interesting paper that was published in 2019, basically looking at the role that ultra-processed versus unprocessed foods has in leading to changes in food intake. And so there's a lot of criticisms of this work, but it was a very nicely controlled randomized trial where people were provided a diet or a menu of foods that they could select. Now, they didn't pay for any of these foods, and so payment can influence choices. But when ultra-processed foods like burgers and chips and cheesies and sugar-sweetened beverages were presented, well, lo and behold, people ate more and they gained weight. Whereas if it was an unprocessed diet, which is likely higher or lower in energy density and some of the nutrients of concern, people actually lost weight. And so this paper generated a lot of discussion and a lot of issues. And I think one of the things that we do need to be mindful of is if your diet consists primarily of ultra-processed foods, then I think there is the potential that we need to pay attention to ad libitum, the impacts on intake. But keep in mind that this particular study didn't really restrict how much food that you could consume, and so it's somewhat artifactual in that nature, but it does point to a really interesting opportunity to reflect on what's happening there from a physiological standpoint. Now let's get back to Health Canada's guidance. Health Canada doesn't actually use the NOVA classification system when they're looking at the impact of processing and sustainable diets. What they recommend, Health Canada recommends limiting highly processed foods. So they don't use the term ultra-processed. They used a specific definition called highly processed foods. And in fact, what they state is that we should avoid highly processed foods that add excess sodium, sugars, or saturated fat to the diets of Canadians. And I think it's an important distinction for blanketing all ultra-processed foods versus those foods that carry these, what we call the nutrients of concern. And Health Canada has actually moved to add a front of pack labeling system, and the deadline will be January 1st, 2026 for all companies to apply. They can start using it now, but it takes time to change labels and get all your foods in order. And some people might want to start reformulating their food products so they don't actually have to carry a high-in label on it. So if you are greater than 15% of the daily value for saturated fat, sodium, or sugars, you'll need to carry this front of pack warning label on your food product. And so 2026, 3 years away, but it does give time for industry to reflect and to even change their formulations so that they're not carrying these labels. So with that as a backdrop, I want to just talk a little bit about how we define nutritional quality. And this is just one way that you could, and there's many different ways that you could look at nutritional quality, but I've tried to focus on a couple of areas that I think are worthy of further exploration. So first of all, let's look at macronutrient quality. So that's, if you're talking about protein, so protein quality, so the digestibility or availability of the protein, and as well as its amino acid composition. Those are the two primary components that really factor into our understanding of protein quality. Other macronutrient quality parameters like lipid quality, the ratio of saturates to unsaturates. And this is going to be more and more important as we move forward, especially from a front of pack labeling. Again, the reason why Health Canada is advocating and requiring these changes to be put into place is because those are the nutrients that have the greatest association with risk for the development of chronic disease, in particular diabetes, cancer, cardiovascular disease. So a focus on saturates, even though there's a lot of data out there that is somewhat contentious with respect to this linkage. Not all saturates are created equal is another way to look at it. And I think it's an area that requires further reflection. And then we've got carbohydrate quality, such as, well, if it's fiber, it promotes a different biological response than if it's a highly available starch. So we measured one of the areas that relates to carbohydrate quality is this, what we call the glycemic response. To what extent does a particular carbohydrate source raise your blood glucose levels? With for those that have raised them high and rapidly, reflect a food that tends to spike insulin, which can ultimately lead to a condition called insulin resistance, which is a forerunner of type 2 diabetes. And so that's one of the reasons why this glycemic response has been an area that has received a lot of attention. So that's macronutrient quality. Another area to consider is just overall nutrient density. So looking at the contribution that vitamins, minerals, and trace elements and bioactives make, and seeing that we've covered the macronutrients up above. Yeah, you can also include them down here in the nutrient density as well, in terms of the overall contribution to the composition of the food product. But we also can't forget about certain anti-nutritional factors. So these are products that are found in food. They can be either endogenous, and so as a natural component of the food itself, such as a trypsin inhibitor, for example, which tends to inhibit protease activities, or it can be exogenous, and so added onto the natural food product. So for example, a grain in the field, if it happens to be infected with a fungus like fusarium, can have certain mycotoxins which can limit and perhaps suppress nutrient digestion and availability. And there are also other food additives which are that we are starting to pay more attention to in terms of their ability to influence digestive processes. And I'll give you one example in just a moment. So protein quality, as I mentioned, is related to amino acid composition. How well does the amino acid pattern match human amino acid needs? And then digestibility and availability. To what extent are the amino acids digested, absorbed, and ultimately made available for metabolic demands? So one areas that we tend to focus on is that these methods fit in with the main systems that we currently use to measure protein quality. Both of these concepts factor into the protein efficiency ratio, which is generally the required method that's needed by Health Canada to basically substantiate protein content claims. Health Canada does now accept what's called the Protein Digestibility Corrected Amino Acid Score, or PDCAS. But both of these can be used to calculate what's called a protein rating. And then you also have the digestible indispensable amino acid score, which is a system that has been promoted by the FAO, first published in 2013. It's still working its way through the regulatory environment. I'm sure we'll see it to one extent or another in the future, but I feel that there's some certain areas that need to be addressed before it becomes utilized in Canada and in North America. Well, even in fact, globally, there's some interpretations that need to be addressed, but I'll save that for another day. Here are the systems again. So if we're looking at content claims, so if you want to say that it's a good source of protein or an excellent source of protein on a label, in Canada, you have to use what's called the protein rating system, which is based on the PER or PDCAS. In the US, they use PDCAS. And in Europe, it's basically not quality, it's quantity of protein. So that's a difference between Canada, US, and the European Union. And as I mentioned, this DIAS method is a proposed method, and we'll likely see it coming into jurisdictional regions in the not too distant future. So if we're thinking just about plant protein quality in general, there are a number of factors that play a role in influencing plant protein quality on both the amino acid side and the digestibility availability side. And so a lot of these factors have been studied. And so the nice thing about this capture program that we're all here to support is allowed collaborations to exist. For example, Dr. Nickerson's team has done a lot of work, and we've collaborated with Dr. Nickerson in terms of looking at the role that thermal processing and fermentation, germination, sprouting plays on both the amino acid content as well as digestibility and availability of protein sources. So wherever you see a little question mark, it's basically calling into question whether or not we have sufficient data to support this. And it's an area for active investigation. So management factors, we need to understand a little bit more. And this is primarily at the level of the, when we're growing the crops. So the fertilization rates, for example. Environmental factors. I think we know that fertility can influence amino acids, but the extent that it influences digestibility is still somewhat in question. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. And so this is a paper that is just under review. We're just addressing some of the reviewer comments. And Amanda Saw is a postdoc in our lab that looked at samples from a diversity panel from the University of Saskatchewan. So working with Dr. Kirsten Bett on this, and really looking at the variability. So the shape of these curves basically reflects that there's a lot of variability inherent within lentils. And there are different methods, different reference patterns that people are using to estimate the amino acid score, which ultimately goes into calculating the DIAS or the PDCAS method. And depending on the score that you use, you can get a very different number. And so, for example, here tryptophan tends to be limiting in lentils. And so this area down here, the bottom on the left-hand side for tryptophan, shows you the variability in the amino acid score. So anything less than 100, it means that there's a limitation. But if you're using the adult score, which I've seen in marketing materials for some companies using the adult reference pattern, all of your data is going to be above 100. So that automatically skews the quality to the right. So it improves the interpretation of the quality parameters. So in North America, we have to use the 1991 data. It's in our requirements. And so just be mindful that the choice of reference pattern can really influence the interpretation of the quality of protein sources. Blending is another area that you can actually increase the protein quality. Here's just examples of adding lentil flour, yellow pea flour, chickpea flour to wheat, and increasing by adding, so if you add 30% of the pulse flours to wheat flour, you can get a relatively high protein quality, 30 to 40%, you can improve the quality. And so you're starting to see products that have added lentil flours or pea flours to increase not only the fiber, but also the protein quality of the food. And so there's an opportunity by understanding blending options to enhance protein quality. Just promoting some recent work that we've been doing, and this is really being led by Dr. Phyllis Coxell in her extrusion program. And here we're looking at using sunflower meal as a as a precursor for making high moisture meat analogs. So this little diagram on the bottom shows an example of a meat analog being formed on from an extruder. And you can see if you have 37.5% sunflower meal with the rest being soy isolate, you can actually get a very high in vitro PDCAS score, close to 90%. It goes down a little bit as you increase the sunflower meal, because sunflower meal tends to have a lower score relative to soy. And so, but you still get everything above 80%. And so we can actually create analogs that have a high protein quality score. And so it's an example of a co-product. So thinking about circular economy, utilizing co-products to enhance the preparation of new food products. Down here, there's an example of a sunflower tofu that we actually have made in the past. And it's an opportunity to prepare foods that are derived from what is typically would have gone into livestock feeding, for example. Now, if you're looking at other opportunities for plant-based proteins, you've got milling, physical, biological, chemical process. All of these can impact not only the nutritional attributes, but also sensory and functional attributes. And one area is this emulsification. I'll come back to that at the end of this presentation, because it's an area that I think is important to start looking at. If we actually can understand how certain proteins are, as we modify them during the biological, physical, or chemical processes, we can actually understand that they might be able to replace the addition of added emulsifiers that are currently being used in the foods in food production. So going back to this to our slide on factors influencing nutrient density. So it is a major challenge with highly and ultra processed foods. Do you lose the benefits ascribed to whole plant foods if you're breaking the ingredients down and only using a portion of those foods? And so certainly I think there needs to be that recognition that whole foods are more than just the sum of the nutrients that they contain. There are lots of other bioactives, lots of other compounds that we still don't even know the role that these can play. So we have to be mindful of that. But certainly when we're thinking about nutritional guidance, there is an opportunity for the food sector to position nutrient-dense foods low in sugars, saturated fats, and sodium. So again, just focusing on these key nutrients, I'm pulling back this slide that I showed earlier that's looking at opportunities, the red being what things that we want to reduce in plant protein foods, and green being things that we are either a natural advantage in plant-based foods or that we might want to consider. So it's focusing on quality of the protein, focusing on enhancing vitamin D in plant-based foods, or maintaining the focus on dietary folate equivalents. So one of the ways that we can do this is by addressing nutrient density. There is a regulatory framework for this. And so fortification is a process by which vitamins, minerals, nutrients, and amino acids are added to foods with sufficient but not excessive amounts of certain nutrients in their diet. And so we have a framework established within the Food and Drug Regulations that allows for this. And it can be separated into what we call mandatory versus voluntary fortification. So I'm going to give you an example of one food product. It's not meant to be an endorsement, it's just a good example. So here's a meat analog. It's Beyond Beef. I think most of you have probably seen it. Here's the extract from the Food and Drug Regulations. So simulated meat products, simulated poultry meat, mandatory vitamin fortification exists. So thiamine, riboflavin, niacin, in particular B12, because if you're substituting this Beyond Beef for an animal protein, B12 is normally contained within those animal protein sources. And so we need to make sure that that is present. And for the amino acids, it needs to have these histidine, isoleucine. These are all the essential or indispensable amino acids. If you look at the ingredients, you can actually see how this food product addresses it. So it actually lists vitamins and minerals that are added. So niacin, pyridoxine. Some of them that may not be there are likely in sufficient enough quantities within the ingredients that they can actually justify not using them. Like, for example, copper. Copper likely is present in many of the ingredients like pea protein or some of the other mung bean protein in sufficient levels that are more than adequate to meet the needs. And amino acids, you don't need to add the amino acids because they're present within the protein sources itself. And so if by looking at the ingredients, you mandatory fortification. One of the things to keep in mind, though, is that saturated fats, 30% of the 30% of the daily value is presented as saturated fats. And so if we're thinking about that front of pack label, I think Beyond Beef probably has some work to do in order to reduce that to below than 15% if they don't want to carry a warning label, front of pack label that it's greater than 15%. And if you look at where it's coming from, it's primarily coming from refined coconut oil, which it tends to be high in saturated fats, but it's a different type of saturated fat. So it's something that the industry has moved to. So it is an area that we do need to be mindful of. And they're getting close to sodium, but they're still under. So just some last slides on anti-nutritional factors. So these are components of food that suppress nutrient utilization or negatively impact digestive function. So again, as I mentioned, we have endogenous factors like protease inhibitors, trypsin inhibitors that would be in that class. Lectins, these are carbohydrate-based molecules which tend to impact the integrity of the intestinal lining. So these are again endogenous factors which have suppressive effects on overall digestibility. Phytate is basically a inositol-based sugar molecule, but it very tightly binds to phosphorus, for example, but it also binds to other trace elements and minerals. And so we need to be mindful that it can suppress overall mineral availability. Now, on the exogenous factors, looking at naturally derived, example, mycotoxins, but there are some food additives that we might need to be paying a little bit more attention to, especially as consumers are demanding more and more what we're calling green labels or clean labels, so that we can see, as you saw with that last food product, the Beyond Beef, there's a lot of ingredients in there. And so I think the consumer is arguing that I'd like to see a cleaner label, perhaps one that doesn't have as many components in it. So here's just some work looking at 2017 data, looking at trypsin inhibitor activity. So raw, soaked versus cooked, split yellow pea, green pea, red lentil, whole chickpea, and black bean. I think what this data is showing you is that if you're looking at trypsin inhibitor, which is it's a protease inhibitor, raw has significant amount, just by soaking doesn't really do anything. You need thermal treatments, cooking, to actually diminish it dramatically. And so I think this slide really highlights that nicely. But you have to be careful about how high you go, because obviously, while heat is important from a processing standpoint, it can also damage the protein. And so reactive lysine is a source, is a way to measure how much of that lysine is actually available to be used to make proteins when it's consumed. And what this is showing is that as the amount of heat goes up, the amount of reactive lysine goes down. And so you're actually damaging that lysine. So it's not available to make protein when it's consumed. And so there is a balancing act that's required there. Now, this is just the one example that I wanted to highlight. It's an area that's receiving a lot of attention. I was just at a nutrition conference, and this was raised in the question and answer period. The use of carboxymethylcellulose or methylcellulose as an emulsifying agent, widely used in the food supply. But there is data, and this is just one study where they did a randomized control feeding study of carboxymethylcellulose to look at the impacts on gut microbiota and metabolome. And essentially what they found is that it is having an impact. You get depletion of the fecal metabolome. And so you're actually seeing changes in the metabolites that are created by the gastrointestinal microflora. And so what that means, I think, is something that we still need to interpret. But I think this is just one example of how items that we're putting in our food supply may not necessarily be causing traditional toxicological effects, but we can start seeing, with our greater understanding of factors that influence the gut microbiota and metabolomics, so using more high throughput technologies, we're starting to see that this is one example of how a food additive can potentially negatively impact the changes within the gut. So it's something that we do need to be mindful of. So I'm going to finish here and just say that there are multiple drivers to positioning plant-based proteins as sustainable food sources, that we should be reflecting on all 4 dimensions of sustainability. I focus primarily on the health dimension, but don't forget that they're all intricate, they're all intimately linked. When we show the 4 dimensions, it's intentionally done as a Venn diagram to show that there really aren't, these aren't separate dimensions, that there is areas of overlap. And that we can use novel processing methods to develop nutrient-dense plant-based foods that are low in saturated fat, sodium, and sugars. And I think by paying attention to these dimensions, it can help us drive some of the goals for these processing methods. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. I'd like to thank all of my trainees. For some of you are in the audience today. I want to thank you for all the contributions that you make to the work that's done in the lab. Thanks to Dr. Nickerson for all the collaborations that we've done over the last several years in this area, and to my colleagues as well for the collaborations. And also to mention that we had this work wouldn't be possible without the funding that we received from our funding sources, and in particular, just to highlight NSERC and its funding of the NSERC Create Capture program, which is one of the reasons we're all here today. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and be happy to take any questions for the last few minutes.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim. That was fantastic. If you have questions, we can just take them in the chat or put up your hand, and I'll call on you. Oh, Rotimi has a question. Go ahead.
Oh, thanks, Jim. Hopefully you can hear me well.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, 2 quick questions. One, I was at a conference and, there was a heated argument about the correctness of saying that plant protein production or plant products have less carbon footprint than animal products. I'm not sure that you have come across such argument.
Oh, yes.
Because, the guy claims that by the time you take all the processing that needs to be done to convert, a seed, for example, into a flour, into extract the protein, to do the texturization, blah blah blah, and then to deal with how do you handle the non-protein component? He was saying that really when you calculate that, in his opinion, plant proteins actually are more carbon intensive than animal protein. So just want to get your own perspective.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Rotimi, and it's really important that we continue to have these discussions, because one of the areas that industry in particular, and this is good for all the trainees that are thinking about going into working in industry, and through any connections that you might be having, what we need to understand is what's called the life cycle assessment component. And so to your point is that we need to understand all aspects of the production system and how it contributes to carbon, not only release, but sequestration. And so that you can have a true understanding of the greenhouse gas emissions. I think there has been a lot of debate, and unfortunately, some of it's becoming somewhat politicized as well in terms of which group that you're representing. So there are biases that creep into this. I show my own biases as well. But as long as we're using a science-based approach where we're doing the best measurements, and that's one of the things that's happening right now in Canada is an inventory of the life cycle assessments of the impact of, say, a production method on a particular protein source. But do we have data for all elements? No, I would argue not. But just don't forget, we also have a lot of processing that happens on the animal side as well.
Yeah, and very quickly, just a second one. Where do you see plant-based foods in the next 10 years? Because again, there was a recent posting on LinkedIn that really say, yeah, it's over, it's a fad, even presented data to show that there has been a decrease in the sales of plant-based foods. And there's somebody commented that the guy that wrote that was probably from the animal group, but what do you see, how do you see plant-based foods in the next 10 years? Just your own opinion.
Well, and again, another great question. And I think the article that's been getting a lot of attention was published in Bloomberg not too long ago. And essentially they looked at the sales and year-to-year sales of, in particular, meat analogs. So they were primarily focused on the Impossible Burger, Beyond Beef, and to see what's happening within those categories. But don't forget, we've got a very wide spectrum of what constitutes a plant-based foods. And so paying attention to our grain-based food sources and how we can include more protein there. But if we're focusing primarily on the meat analogs, which is really the focus of that article, yes, we have seen dramatic reductions in single classes, but in fact, Impossible had significant increases overall because they introduced more products. And so if you just look within a category, I think it's a challenge. But last year, and it's still continuing this year, is very difficult from a predictive standpoint because the food supply and the cost of the foods within the food supply very different than it was a year ago. And so with all the challenges in supply chains, I think it's making it very difficult to predict. Had we been using sort of the baseline data that we had in 2021, I might have been more comfortable in predicting. But I think we're going to still see opportunities. It's a major trend. It has been a major trend for years. And I don't think that the next generation, the Gen Zs and the next gen, I forget what the next generation, I think it's the Gen Alpha, that they're coming in, they're demanding change in our food supply. And so it may not be the foods that we're looking at now, like the Impossible Burgers and the Beyond Beef, but there could be new market opportunities for novel food products that don't necessarily, that aren't burgers or meat alternatives. They could be completely novel preparations of plant-based foods, but just putting them in the form that are convenient, that actually have flavor profiles that the consumer is looking for, and that are accessible. So I think that was a long-winded answer to your question, Rotimi, but you raised some really good points.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Great presentation. Thanks.
Thanks. Any other questions, maybe from a student, or I can see the chat if you want to use it, or you can just raise your hand and I'm happy to. Aaron Goldberg raised their hand. Go ahead, Aaron.
Hi, Jim. Thanks. Great presentation. You talked about the anti-nutritional factors, including the food additives. So other than carboxymethylcellulose, do you have any other examples of other data showing these detrimental effects to the microbiome, or really any other effects that are happening in the body?
Well, I raised this one just because I think it's an opportunity, because one of the areas that we can look at is the natural emulsifying property of proteins, even especially as they're being modified through thermal or other processing treatments. And so maybe we can replace, so it presents an opportunity to replace added emulsifiers within food systems. I didn't really do a broad review of other natural components, but we know that there are, if you're talking specifically about components that are added, then I think we can reflect on sort of the quality of the lipid sources that we're using. I think that would be one area that we might want to pay attention to. We're using a lot of tropical oils right now, and I think that's one area that we might need to pay particular attention to. Structured lipids is another area that I think is something that there's no real evidence of negative effects, but I think it's an area that we might want to pay attention to. But in answer to your question, I really just focus on just this one example as just to highlight it, but it does open up the opportunity to focus on what currently is present within our in our toolkit to improve the sensory and flavor profiles of our processed foods, and perhaps reflect on how other ways of approaching that.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I was kind of thinking about artificial sweeteners too, because you're seeing
yes
so much new data, even looking at brain health.
Okay, yeah, that's another example for sure. We do need to have the data to support convincing of it. I'm always hesitant to show results from a single randomized controlled trial. Optimally, you want to look at studies that are more of a systematic review. I'm seeing another hand up. Go ahead.
Oh, hi, Jim. It's me, John.
Okay, go ahead, John.
That was a good presentation, really interesting. The question I had is you talked about trypsin inhibitors and being kind of like inactivated using heat, which is good. And then you talked about lysine degradation because as you heat your proteins, you degrade the lysine.
Right.
So does the inactivation of the trypsin inhibitor outweigh the degradation of the lysine, or is it vice versa?
Yeah, it's a good point. I think when you are looking at, in particular, the type of thermal treatment that we use, is more, if you're using more of a wet-based the thermal process, such as even extrusion, where it's not direct dry heat, especially when you have a lot of reducing sugars present. I think the opportunity to damage that lysine is probably diminished to a certain extent. But I think it is that balancing act that we do need to pay attention to. And it may be that, I think with trypsin inhibitors, most of our data is likely coming from livestock and an understanding of suppression of digestibility, where the entire dietary supply is being provided by 1 or 2 or 3 ingredients. So to actually link it to adverse health conditions in humans, where it's occasionally a component of the diet, is something that's a little bit more challenging to recommend or to focus on.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Jim, for a great presentation. That was fantastic. And look forward to seeing most of you next time. Make sure to invite all your colleagues to join us. And this presentation will be up on the website in probably a couple of weeks. All right.
Super. Thanks, Lenore. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.